Hey, deserving listeners, this is Chapter 3 in my deep dive on limerence. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. I still have a cold. I hope it's not too bothersome. I'm trying to have the microphone at a particular distance. I'm trying to EQ things so that it's not too annoying. Hopefully it's okay. So in the interim between Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, I nerded out even further into limerence. I've been really hung up on the question as to what is the difference between people that have normal infatuation at the beginning of a crush or relationship or something, and those who develop what I would call pathological limerence. What is that difference? Because most people, and experts included, would agree that even in healthy or normal infatuation, falling in love, you will have these intrusive thoughts, these infatuations, an obsessive drive towards another person. So what is it that differentiates between people that have that normal infatuation that can cause all kind of problems, of course, but it can also bond people, drive people towards each other? What's the difference between that and people who develop pathological limerence? Because a lot of experts will say that it's both limerence. I'm not calling normal infatuation limerence because I'm trying to section off the word limerence for pathology because I think it's more helpful. So I was really mulling this question over because I thought that I had a satisfactory answer to that. I had developed a bit of a theory as to why some people develop pathological limerence. It was mainly based on the qualitative responses on the survey. But I gave it some more thought and I landed on something. I said, oh my God, am I having another eureka moment? And I don't want to use the word eureka to elevate myself, but it feels that way to me. And I don't hear other experts using this kind of language, which I don't know if I just haven't come across it or if it's such a new topic that there just isn't a lot of investigation or even attempt to have a unifying theory of the cause of limerence. It's similar to my experience with the literature on borderline personality. If you've been listening to the podcast, you know that I have a lot of experience with it. I have a pretty comprehensive theory as to the cause and the experience and the treatment and the recovery. And I often will experience when I'm reading literature or I'm hearing experts talk about borderline on YouTube or something, that I will think, well, yeah, I mean, you're not wrong, but you're missing the core element here, which is the relational trauma and how that can in turn cause all the things that we see with borderline. I'm simplifying it. But when I landed on that conceptualization, which isn't mine, by the way, it's an old conceptualization that's shared by object relations, psychodynamic sort of folks. I don't remember if I developed it sort of on my own or if I absorbed or both or something. But anyway, so with limerence, there isn't the sort of clinical literature history as there is with borderline, not even close. So there's a chance that I might actually be given by the patrons, because they pay my bills, the ability to really dive into something and incorporate all the knowledge that I have from all the other aspects of my expertise and my career and my experience. I'm in this unique position, I think, or not unique, but rare position in that as an academic, I can pursue a new topic every month. Whereas in typical academia, you focus on a very narrow topic for your entire career. And there's a benefit to having some depth across the board on a lot of different topics, because then you can integrate a lot of the knowledge and the learning and the understandings, and you can bring a lot of things together. So, this is just me talking out loud. I'm a little embarrassed to say all of this because it comes across like I'm stuck on myself or something. And maybe that's true. But I can't wait to describe to you what I think I have discovered. later on. But let's get into chapter 3 here. So this chapter is going to be mainly about the signs and symptoms of limerence. I'm going to this might even take a couple chapters, because as I go through the signs and symptoms, it's going to get micro in terms of what it's like to suffer from limerence. And as I go through each category of symptom, I'm going to reference the responses on the survey to flesh it out, because I think that really helps. So let's get into it. All right, so I thought I would start with just an overview of what one might call the signs of limerence. You can think about this for yourself and the people around you. And this is like a very quick overview. And then after that, I'll go into each individual symptom in depth. But the signs, as I would describe it, is that the individual has intrusive, obsessive thinking about the limerent object. Sometimes the obsession increases as uncertainty or lack of reciprocation increases. So contrary to what might happen for most people, or what most people might intuit, is that as reciprocation becomes even more uncertain or more unlikely, you would think that the intrusive thoughts would actually decrease. But for people suffering from pathological limerence, often as the reciprocation becomes more uncertain or more unlikely, the obsession gets even more intensified, sometimes greatly so. So intrusive, obsessive thinking, this is a hallmark. One might even think of it as a necessary symptom even to qualify for what we would call pathological limerence, or limerence disorder, as I will describe later on. The second sign is excessive longing for reciprocation, right? So the intrusive thoughts can involve a lot of different types of thoughts, but one of them is, oh, I just really want reciprocation. I really want them to love me. I really want them to notice me. I really want them to tell me how they feel about me. I really want them to be with me, that kind of thing. And in this sign, or this aspect of limerence, there is a hypersensitivity to any sign of reciprocation, real or imagined. And there's a tendency to interpret or distort innocuous behavior from the limerent object as being clear signs of reciprocation. This is kind of another hallmark of limerence, of like, oh, she smiled, the cashier smiled at me today. That must mean, or does it mean? Maybe it means. And then it's the thinking and the rumination and that sort of thing. The third sign is compulsive checking, aimed at finding reassurance or clues of reciprocation or affection or something. So this is what we might, if we compare this to OCD, this is the C part of the OCD. The O leads to C, which leads to the D. I never thought about it. So when you try to understand obsessive compulsive disorder, you want to think of it starting with obsessions, leading to compulsions, which causes the disorder. The end result is, as a whole, is a disorder, meaning it causes problems. So with the intrusive obsessive thinking and the longing, then that compels the person to check and to find reassurance of reciprocation, even when it's uncertain. I want to be clear that for some people with limerence, even in the throes of limerence, they would agree that the signs of limerence aren't really there, but they're just really hopeful, right? Other people with limerence will distort reality to convince themselves that the signs are there when they're not really there. So there's a range there, but there's at least typically an element of compulsive checking. And that can take a lot of forms. It can take the form of checking someone's social media. It can take the form of, if you have limerence, for a cashier at the grocery store, that you go to the grocery store 5 times a day or something. Or it could even just be checking in your own mind of, okay, remember when he did that thing? And, oh yeah, what did that mean? And you check in with the same experience you had with the limerent object. So it's just this compulsive, like looking and seeking, whether that means things that you would observe from the outside of the limerent person or things you couldn't observe from the outside. Sometimes this can involve stalking. It's not the common response, but it can. Mild, moderate, severe, which I'll define later. Another way in which the compulsive checking might manifest is that the limerent person will talk about the limerent object to their friends and family incessantly. Sometimes this is a temporary period before the limerent person becomes ashamed of their limerence and will just do this in private, but often in the beginning energetic phase of limerence, or the naive phase of limerence, before the limerent person starts to realize, oh, maybe there's something wrong with me about this, they will talk about it with their friends and family of just like, okay, well then she said this. What do you think? Or, oh my gosh, she's the best. And so there can be an element of that in one's life. The fourth major sign of limerence is that the limerent person, their mood will shift depending on their perception of reciprocation. And it'll be noticeable often from the outside and very noticeable from the inside. So during periods of seeming or perceived reciprocation, the person will feel euphoric and buoyant and in love, and everything is beautiful and everyone is wonderful, and they have high self-esteem and they're optimistic, and the way you feel when you're falling in love or you have a crush on someone. During periods of uncertainty or during periods in which the limerent person is unable to reassure themselves that reciprocation might be possible or is happening, then the limerent person experiences severe distress and severe hardship and obsession and shame and hurt, and often it will manifest in somatic symptoms. That's one of the hallmarks often, not all the time, but it's frequently reported by people with limerence that they will have physical symptoms of the limerence. When they're euphoric, they'll have energy. It'll if they have back pain, it'll go away, that kind of thing. And during periods when they're on the downswing, then they'll have pain. Even heartache can be described, a pain in the chest, in the upper chest, which seems to be a way in which our body tells ourselves or manifests the emotion of unrequited love or being hurt by a romantic partner, which leads to why linguistically we have this phrase in our culture called breaking someone's heart, or I have heartache for some. It seems like we manifest our emotions physically in that way. The fifth sign is that the individual will engage actively in vivid fantasies about the limerent object, often involving reciprocation, right? This can take a lot of different forms. It can take the form in a very simple manner in which the person thinks about the cashier reaching across the the desk or the table there. What do you call that? The checkout counter. And the cashier says, oh my God, I'm in love with you, and kisses the person. Or the fantasy could be that you're living together and you're having sex. That's a frequent thing, is to fantasize while masturbating or something. Another fantasy is of saving the limerent object, or the limerent object saving you. Like there's a hijacking of an airplane or something. Well, that's a little funny, but or there's a mugger that jumps out at the limerent object, and because you're frequently there watching the limerent object, you spring into action and save them, and then the limerent object is in your arms and says, thank you for saving me, and you're the best. And then it's like the rom-coms, which is an element of all love, including what we could call limerence. So there's that. Also, there can be vivid fantasy about past encounters with the limerent object, when the limerent object seemed to be reciprocating, or even when the limerent object did. Like in the case of having limerence for a former partner, the person can relive moments of actual life with this person, that sort of thing. And then The sixth hallmark or sign of limerence is that all of this causes distress and impairment to aspects of life. So significant distress and or impairment to your work, your relationships, your health, that sort of thing. So I put that in there because it gives a threshold, a sort of a threshold that can help people delineate between the kind of limerence or the kind of infatuation that occurs normally that can also be hard, like everything I just described in terms of intrusive thoughts, excessive longing, compulsive checking, mood swings dependent on reciprocation, engaging in fantasy. You can have that in normal love or infatuation feelings, right? You can have that in the first week of a crush that eventually dissipates. You can have that after being broken up with, either by a Tinder date that you went on a few dates with, or by your long-term partner of 5 years that they dumped you, or you have a friend that you have a crush on or something. Like, you could have all those feelings, but the threshold that I'm trying to establish is that we use the DSM philosophy regarding what constitutes a disorder, a pathology, a mental illness. And mental illness has a whole other, some people think of mental illness as only comprising of like schizophrenia and bipolar and that sort of thing. But if we just keep it to the word disorder in the DSM, then I think it is helpful because then we can say, okay, well, is it clinically significant distress? Is it causing distress? Yeah, after being dumped, you could have these feelings. Is it causing I guess the other element as I'm going through this is some sort of time span. I'm going to add that. So I just added the phrase lasting longer than normal or not being within normal limits in terms of time span. Now, what do we mean by normal? Well, that's the nature of these kinds of things. It's why with pathological grief, I was unhappy that they you went down the direction of prolonged grief. I write about this in my book, by the way. I would have rather had them call it complicated grief because that doesn't put a time span on the threshold, So I'm not a huge fan of locking things in terms of time span. Having said that, to fit within the DSM, and I think there's some wisdom to it, kind of, as long as there's a major asterisk. I do include a time span on my proposed criteria. I'll just skip forward and spoil that I say over a period of at least 6 months on more days than not, the individual experiences, blah, blah, blah. So I'm saying 6 months, but if I were to fully write this up, I would say that you could argue that some people could qualify even though it wasn't 6 months long if the clinician deemed it applicable. Okay. All right. So let's take a break. And when we get back, let's get into the symptoms more thoroughly. All right. We're back from the break. So the first symptom I want to go into detail about is the functional impact. This is that threshold between having a crush or even having low-level limerence that doesn't cause problems in your life and limerence that is a pathology, limerence that causes problems, limerence that is a disorder, disordered limerence. And I want to be upfront about describing this because as we move forward, we need to understand just how severe this can be. So limerence negatively, pathological limerence is defined by me and others as negatively affecting daily life and overall functioning. Work, relationships, sleep, other kinds of things can all be disrupted by the preoccupation and the emotional volatility of limerence. So to go into a little bit more detail, the intrusive thoughts are often the cause of the functional impact. Also the emotional volatility. So these things aren't just things that feel bad to the person. They're not just like, oh, that's kind of a bummer. They become an obsession. They intrude on everyday life. They're either actively intruding in the moment or they're a background annoyance that is happening at all times. One way to think about it is that It's like you are if you've ever tried to quit a substance like cigarettes or cocaine or alcohol or caffeine, and there's that first few days where there's this nagging itch that's constantly bombarding your mind and body that is telling you to use or to get to that thing. And you're sitting in a meeting and you just have this nagging itch of just like, you need to smoke, you need caffeine, you need alcohol, you need cocaine, you need heroin or something. It's just like you can't really live in the moment. And I think most people can understand it, even people who haven't been through that. Well, that's what limerence is all the time, or at least during its more prominent moments. And for people, they'll report that it is most of the time, for months, years, that kind of thing. So that's why it impacts functioning. It's not just like when you're reminded of a past partner or a crush that hasn't reciprocated, you're like, oh, bummer. No, it's intrusive and it intrudes on your life involuntarily. So the person will often eventually enter this living two different lives where they're trying to live their life normally as a parent, as a spouse, as a worker, as a friend or something, but their inner world is this turmoil. Okay. So other examples of functional impact is that people will report losing hours of productivity at work because they keep checking messages. They reread old conversations. They might be mentally rehearsing interactions. And again, they have these intrusive thoughts or this itch that is interfering. So they will report often, and when I get to the survey responses, there's some responses along these lines of only being able to be productive at work for like an hour or two. Also, another example is a random text from the LO. Let's say someone has limerence for their friend, and there's this random text from their limerent object, and it happens midway through the day, and all of a sudden it throws the limerent person into a spiral of rumination and intrusive thoughts and wondering and checking, that kind of thing. Sleep can also become a problem, not only from the stress, but also from the intrusive thoughts, or some people will report anxiety that will just wake them out of their sleep, and they can't stop thinking about the limerent object at 3 a.m. in the morning, and that can be a problem. Also, ordinary tasks like just making dinner for the kids or replying to emails or paying the bills can become delayed, or you can be so distracted that you can't really concentrate and you make mistakes on these things because the mind keeps wanting to think about the limerent object. So that's examples. Relationships can also become a problem, obviously, because the limerent object will, the thoughts of the limerent object will be invading the person's mind, and it can result in the limerent person being emotionally unavailable for people, or irritable as their moods go up and down, or distracted even if they're euphoric, or just annoying with how often they're talking about the limerent object or something. Also, partners. There's a fair amount of people who experience limerence who are married or partnered with someone, and sometimes the partners knows some about the limerence, sometimes they don't. But either way, the partners are going to suffer, right? Either from neglect or confusion or just jealousy and being hurt, that sort of thing. Other things that we can talk about is that some people will avoid social events because the limerent object might contact them. It's like, oh, my friends are inviting me out tonight, but what if the limerent object, what if she texts me tonight and I'm distracted, or she whatever, that kind of, or they will orient their activities to run into the limerent object and avoid things like their friends and family or other kind of stuff. Professionally, people will describe missing deadlines, making mistakes, calling in sick because they're ruminating too much, or they even want that. That's another aspect to the limerence, is that it is largely involuntary, but there can be a volitional element. there can be an active participation in it. And in this way, it's kind of similar in my mind. It has some overlap with eating disorders. When I specialized in treating eating disorders, it was very apparent to me after treating, especially the people with legit moderate to severe eating disorders, is that you're not only struggling with the eating disorder, but you're struggling as a therapist, you're struggling with the person themselves, because they often will have a part of them that wants to do it. And so they will lie to you, or will drop out of therapy because they can't, they're not ready to change, that kind of thing. Similar to if someone suffers from alcohol use disorder or something like that, or cutting is another thing that might be similar to this. People who suffer from non-suicidal self-injury often, at least in the beginning, will be ambivalent about whether or not they actually want to give it up, that kind of stuff. So limerence can absolutely be that way. It's not always that way, but it very much can be. Also, there's a lot of physiological symptoms. That's why we have these words or phrases in our language about heartache and lovesick, right? A punch in the gut, a burning fire of lust, or whatever, because our bodies manifest all emotions, whether we're aware of it or not. There are some theories that say we don't have emotion without our physical reactivity to things. And it's a way for our body as a system to signal to us that we are experiencing something. We're perceiving and interpreting something in a certain way. Like when you see a danger, like a saber-toothed tiger, and your body gets hot, or your heart starts to race, you might not consciously register the fear until you notice that your heart is racing. Or the heart racing happens automatically, and automatically your brain picks up on the fear because it subconsciously picks up on the heart racing, that kind of stuff. So love and affection and love sickness and drive and unrequited love, we might have evolved a mechanism to have that emotional system to drive us towards coupling, towards being with someone. And if that's engaged all the time, then it can perhaps take a toll on the body. Plus the stress and the distress of the full gamut of the experience of limerence can obviously cause a lot of physiological problems, like appetite problems, chest tightness, anxiety, nausea, headaches, restlessness. Low background buzz of anxiety is often reported, heartache, back pain, migraine, all GI problems. So it really runs the gamut. Okay, so now let's go to the survey. On the follow-up survey, I specifically asked, did it disrupt your life? If you had limerence, did it actually disrupt your life? Because on the first survey, and in a lot of the discussion around limerence, they don't necessarily highlight this enough or investigate it enough. And this is all self-report, but let's get into that data. But let's do it after the break. The rest of this episode will be for patrons of the podcasts. So if you want to hear this whole episode, become a patron. Often the patron episodes are 90 to 120 minutes or more. So just so you know what's on the other side of the paywall. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.